when I travel across the country, and it's connected, I think, to some of what you guys have already said, I just, I like to boil things down to their simplest, form. Kids are arriving in school with incredibly diverse needs. Now, whether they're more diverse than they were before, or whether we just never recognized the diversity of our learners because we had a very traditional way of thinking of average, we can debate that. But kids coming in September are incredibly diverse. Everyone agree with me on that? At the same time, we are increasing expectations. We're not just learning, we're excelling. Right? We know the standards, and again, I'm so used to talking about Common Core, so that you're going to have to forgive me if the C words slip out of my mouth. But whether it's Common Core or any of our standards, we know when we talk about 21st century skills, we're talking about kids needing to have higher order thinking skills, critical thinking skills. So we know we've got diverse kids, we know we have increasing expectations, and here's what I see our dilemma. Here's what I came to as a special ed director. I couldn't work any harder than I was working. There weren't any more hours in the day. There was no more cognitive or physical energy I could put into the job. And I kept on trying to do things louder, But I felt like the old ways didn't hold up any longer. And we have to shift the conversation. And that's where my evolution to, thinking about universal design comes from, is that as a special ed director for 20 years, I couldn't work harder. The majority of my teachers couldn't have worked any harder, and we were running into the same kinds of issues around low achievement, segregation, inclusion at a trivialized, superficial level, and that it just wasn't right, and work wasn't fun, So that's what really brought me to thinking about universal design. And even though regardless of where universal design came into any of our mindsets, we know we have been on a trajectory of a shifting public policy for basically at least 15 to 20 years statutorily, but way before that. And we know the issues around access to curriculum, at the very least, were codified in 1997. I think IDEA 94-142, 1975, really wanted us to do what the law says now, but it really didn't capture the essence of it. It really was about physical access to school, getting kids into school. How many of you were working in 1975? My comrades. Right. How many of you weren't born in 1975? I think some of you are lying, but I won't take any of you to task. You see, this is very interesting. Even in a group of primarily administrators now, normally when I'm talking to a group of teachers, it's all, none of that, they're a bunch of babies. But it's interesting to see in an administrative group how many younger administrators, who some of us have this archival perspective of what special education started out as, and it really was about access to education. It was access to getting in the school door, physical access, social access, but it really missed, or maybe the law didn't miss, but those of us implementing the law, I think, really didn't hit the mark about, once you're in the schoolhouse door, if you don't have meaningful interaction with curriculum, learning is going to be compromised. And that's the steady shift we have seen in public policy and statutory and regulation is since 1997, when IDEA was reauthorized, and the magic words involved in and progress in the general ed curriculum were inserted into the statute, not once, not twice, but probably about 40 times, where Congress said, something's not right out there. We should have seen way better outcomes for kids. Not to say that there weren't significantly improved outcomes since the passage of 94-142, but around those academic achievement gaps, that the gaps were still huge. And they embedded the language that we now talk about, access to the general ed curriculum. That was in 97. 2002, No Child Left Behind follows. All kids will be assessed. We are now going to shine a bright light on kids with disabilities and other kids who have had chronic school achievement gaps. What was it about? Access to the curriculum, getting kids ready. IDEA 2004 basically codifies No Child Left Behind. And while we all are waiting for the updated ESEA and IDEA, and who knows when that's ever going to happen, we have no reason to believe that Congress will retreat from this trajectory. What we do have questions about is, what wacky way will they try to make it happen? You know, when we think about some of the accountability issues, I'm not sure they ever quite get it right. But they will not retreat from this concept of access to the curriculum and getting kids college and career ready, getting kids ready for the 21st century. And the standards movement has been slowly, again, whether you're a Common Core state or not, the standards movement has certainly gotten both feet solidly planted within public education and has captured the imagination, or has in large part actually been conceived of in large part by business and industry. You know, the users of the graduates from public education are saying, we want different widgets coming out of school. And therein lies the problem, is everyone wants a different widget, and those of us who are widget developers know it just is really hard work. It's really, really difficult. And I feel like, this is my favorite cartoon probably, of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Come on, it's either one or the other. Just choose. And we're constantly having to make choices, I think, that many of us have probably lost a night or two of sleep over. And here's how I think about this. And again, I don't work in a public school. I have paid my dues, so I certainly have a certain luxury that nobody can fire me any longer. So it allows me to say things that maybe you can't say. The other is that I'm 62, and it is remarkable to me how my internal filter is really deteriorating. So the things that jump out of my mouth, sometimes I'm even shocked I've said them. So I'm warning you right now that it's anybody's guess what I'm going to say. But I think we have been so, I think, traumatized as educators, as education leaders, about test scores, about accountability, about the pressure of what you have to do, that I think at times it makes us stupid. It makes us choose things that are wrong. We fundamentally know they're wrong for kids, and we're still choosing them. And that's the damned if you do, damned if you don't. When we make fundamentally wrong decisions, here's what I think happens. We make the wrong instructional decision for kids, and they don't pass the test anyway. As opposed to, we make the right instructional choices for how we organize our schools. And I believe we increase the likelihood that more kids over time will meet those accountability measures. So if we're damned if we do, we damned if we don't. I'm always saying err in favor of damned if you do. Damned if we make the right choices about the same things. Doing the same thing doesn't work. And And at some point, we have to be strong and courageous and bold enough to say, we've got to rethink this and begin to, as leaders, talk that talk. I work with teachers all the time, and the stuff I hear them say about you, you personally, but it's like, they're telling us we have to do this, they are telling us we need to do that, and I'm always dying to, who is they? And sometimes I think they is us, that we are communicating sometimes the wrong message to staff, or we may think we're communicating the right message, but we're not checking for understanding. When we look at what they're actually doing, they're on a different wavelength. So I think that's hopefully part of what I would hope captures our imagination today, is just that ability to say for 2.5, 3 hours, let's just think about, reflect around what are our own practices and what can we bring to the table. So here's what I think. And aren't these cute? I figured out how to draw these on my computer. I have a little paint kit. So I thought this was very nice. I know you do too. Thank you. Anyway, so here's what I think is the traditional education system. We know what makes good ed, good general ed. We should have a guaranteed curriculum. Everybody knows what they should be teaching. We use high probability instructional strategies. We have a plan about how to teach. We have fair and equitable assessments that truly allow kids to demonstrate what they know, not what the test question developer wanted them to show. And we know good prevention and early intervention, multiple tier systems of support, RTI, whatever you call it in your particular state. And each of these, no one of these does it. It's the interaction of all of those things that we would say, when all of those pieces come together, we should have a good instructional environment, right? And we have a nice strong rope. Well, we also know what good special education looks like, or what traditionally good special education looked like. When we had kids in self-contained environments, we knew that we had a range of ways to adapt methodology, the delivery of instruction, for some number of kids, actually modify curriculum, assistive technology, augmentative communication systems, that we know what good special ed should look like. And again, it all comes together and we have a really, really strong rope. And this, I think, is what Congress was reacting to in 1997, of them saying, we never, when 94-142 was passed, we never intended for a parallel education system to be developed. And in many, many of our states, that's exactly what happened. There was good gen ed, good special ed, or bad gen ed, bad special ed, whatever, but they really function fundamentally very, very separately. And we had some crossover for sure, but relatively speaking, it's you did your stuff and we did our stuff. Albert Einstein, boy, he captures things pretty well. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. I love that quote. Somebody, some numbers of us created this system. This just didn't happen. It's they did it. See, it's they set this up, but it's us. So we can't keep doing what we have been doing, because what we have been doing, I think, supports this kind of system. We've got to fundamentally think differently. So we can't use the same kind of thinking we used when we created the issues. So what is the thinking we need to substitute? And here's my visual representation of that. It's all of these things are all still necessary. It's just they're not necessary on parallel paths. All kids, over the course of their schooling, will need all of these things in different dimensions, in different forms. For those of us who are in special ed, we also know that an awful lot of the best practices here are special ed practices. So we've already started doing that dance. Somehow or other, it's not acceptable to really acknowledge that. People are offended, to think that general ed, special ed has influenced, there's a real disconnect. And I'm not talking about your school particular, I'm saying as a general rule. So this is what we're trying to do. And when I look at individual kids, what we're trying to do is create collaborative teams, whether it's an IEP team, a school improvement team, I don't care what we're talking about, because we need a gazillion people working on a gazillion teams to do the heavy lifting, but they've got to be collaborative teams, not groups of people, truly high-functioning teams who are working interdependently. Any of you do PLC work, the do-fors work? I mean, that, interdependence, that's the very basis of a professional learning community, is we cannot do this alone. We can only possibly do it because we can be interdependent upon each other to bring a higher order of thinking for solving these problems. And my way of looking at it, like when I look at a kid on an IEP, we don't need good ed, general ed, we don't need good special ed, we need good ed, okay? But all kids need good ed, and good ed is all of this, and the thing that distinguishes your ed from your ed from your ed is just the weave of those strands. But I challenge you to think of any kid who at some point doesn't need all of those strands, and probably needs all of those strands most of the time. Because good differentiated instruction, which is what we think all kids should have, at what point does something go from good instruction to an accommodation, from differentiation to specialty? We don't know that any longer. When kids were in basements, we knew the difference between gen ed and special ed. I have been in this field so long, it is so much muddier to me. Now, I happen to be happy about that. But, when I have to train new teachers about what specially designed instruction is, that's a very challenging thing to do when we're actually trying to muddy the waters, because we want just good instruction to be good instruction. So anyway, this is what, again, has led me to think about universal design. When we say, let's ban the average, design for the edges, this is architecturally designing for the edges. And that's really where universal design comes from. The concept of universal design for learning is directly born out of a group of people in Massachusetts, people who started the organization CAS, Center for Applied Special Technology, a group of technology people and neuropsychologists who sort of latched on to the idea developed by this architect Ron Mace. And the universal design of architecture is you consider the needs of the broadest range of users from the beginning. That's exactly what Rose was talking about of the adjustable seat. There isn't an average pilot. Well, no building in its function is designed for an average person. The building has to be designed for the edges for any of the users who need it, whether it's the ramp, the signage for somebody who's blind, the bars in a toilet for an elderly person who needs, physical support to transfer out of a wheelchair, whatever. So this is the idea of universal design of architecture. And we all, think of the ramp, you think of curb cuts, right? Curb cuts were designed for people in wheelchairs to be able to get around their community. Who else uses curb cuts? Moms with strollers, delivery men, Huh? Bikes, skateboarders, lazy people. Do you know what I'm saying? No, really, really. Think about stairs in your school building. The ramp for the kid in the chair. Who uses it? Your elementary school teachers who cart that big plastic cart around with them? You know, I mean, could they get up the stairs? The UPS guy? You know, grandparents coming for the recital, mom's coming for back to school night, you know, all of those things. It's just such an easy concept in the concrete, you know, when it comes to the physicality, you know, dimension. And what the people at CAST have done is to say, that's the nugget, that's the kernel that really translates to universal design for learning. That the concept in architecture is retrofitting something, okay, building granite steps and then adding the ramp on, retrofitting the building, is fundamentally flawed because it costs more to do that, it takes more time, it's usually not going to be as aesthetically pleasing, and it's fundamentally exclusionary. In other words, oh sure, we want you in the building, we just forgot to think about that when we actually designed the building. So the concept in architecture is we go from the idea of it's okay to retrofit something to saying we build it from the ground up for who needs to use it. And if we go back to the band the average, universal design based on neuroscience basically says there isn't an average student. So let's stop designing things in schools for them because we're probably not designing it correctly for anybody. So one size fits all, retrofit, we've got to move to flexible schools. And what UDL talks about is kids aren't disabled, the curriculum is what has a disability. You know, the curriculum is the one size fits all. So therefore, whether you have a disability or not, if you don't fit that one size, you're on the outside of that. So what's the connection to instruction? And that's the neuroscience part of this, that there's 2+ decades of brain research now that actually supports and verifies what many great teachers have known for decades, and that there isn't an average. That one, the nature of learning differences is the norm. In other words, there isn't an average. Diversity is actually the norm. And how kids learn is not static. It has a direct connection to the stimulus, to the environment that child is in. So in other words, I look at that and I think, oh my God, how empowering to be an educator. Because if we know the environment we build around a kid can actually alter how much they learn, how smart they start seeming. And who controls that environment? Teachers, us. We may not be controlling it well now, but I think that was Todd Rosa's message. What did the Air Force do? They said, we won't play ball with you, you know, jet builders, if you don't play by our rules. So I think this is the empowering part, is we can start designing new rules and then start at the systems level, begin to make those changes. So the neuroscience part of this is they have found out that while we have very, very complex brains, and this is an oversimplification, but that when you look at fundamental learning theory, and you look back to Vygotsky and how kids learn, we have basic brain networks that have been identified that are central to the three aspects of learning that I think we can all wrap our brains around. One is the recognition network, the what of learning. What part of our brains are kicking into gear when we're trying to recognize stimulus, we're trying to make meaning of something presented to us. The strategic network, which is the how of learning. How does a child actually plan and demonstrate what they know? And the affective network, the why of learning. Why would a kid think it's important? What engages that child? And for years, the people, doing UDL have actually presented things in this order. I was really fortunate last summer to take a week-long institute at Harvard with some of these people. And it was really fascinating. I mean, all of the gurus of UDL were there. It was really quite a treat. And one of the big points I got out of it is the most current research is actually supporting, while all of these networks are vital, we oftentimes do not fully understand how this trumps everything. That affective network, the engagement of learners, can trump good recognition networks, good strategic networks. And how we design our schools and our classrooms to deal with the affective needs of kids. To me, the more and more we can begin to put our focus on that, I think for a lot of teachers that's going to be critical. So basically, I want to just sort of review a few things here, and then we'll take a break in about 10 minutes. It's the brain stuff. I find this stuff just fascinating when you can see, really. Now, all of this stuff is happening in nanoseconds. It's not discrete. In other words, your recognition network doesn't work and the other networks aren't working simultaneously. I mean, it's way more complex, obviously. But they have been able to really pinpoint where in our brains, based on fMRIs, those kinds of things, what part of our brain is activated when we're receiving information, when we're strategically planning it, and when we're feeling connected to things. And what they have determined is the diversity of how people's brains do that. That's the one size doesn't fit all. Everybody can be understanding what I'm saying, but all of your brains are processing that in incredibly unique ways. And that's the diversity piece we're talking about. So, recognition network, strategic, affective. So I want to go through this and connect it now. Are people familiar with this chart, the UDL? This is very, very cool. Universal design, and here I want to sort of walk you through the connection, and I'm going to show you some stuff. Recognition, that's the whole back part of our brain. Strategic, the front part. Affective, inside. If you think of these three functions, the what, the how, the why, universal design has created the idea of these three principles of universal design. In other words, in order for us to deal with the diversity of how people recognize information, that back part of our brain, we need to provide multiple means of representation. In other words, if everybody is perceiving and receiving information differently, then if I'm trying to convey information to you, if I'm trying to teach you, I have to provide multiple ways. Because if I taught to the average, nobody necessarily is going to get it. So that's the idea of multiple means of representation is designed to deal with the diversity of how people's recognition networks operate. Multiple means of action and expression is how our strategic network operates, and multiple means of engagement. How do we get kids to set goals, pay attention, sustain attention, self-regulate? All of those things are connected to the affective network. So what CAST has done, the people with Universal Design, have basically said, it's not mumbo jumbo. It's really in my mind, it's the marriage of best instructional practice and neuroscience. It's what we know is good teaching, and now we actually have pictures of our brain that says, it wasn't just a good instinct to do that. It's how the body is wired. We need to, if we are saying we are going to use evidence-based practice, research-based practice, this is the research that talks about, that substantiates how kids are learning. Okay, so the recognition network, recognition is about being able to identify and interpret patterns of sensory information. So if I am introducing a lesson to my class about photosynthesis, it's what are all the components that a learner needs to have operating, and recognizing they all operate differently, to be able to understand. So there are three basic sort of parts to this. Now this happens to highlight vision. There would be one for auditory as well, but at the most basic level there's a perceptual issue. I've got to perceive what you're presenting to me. If I don't have good vision, if I have any kind of sensory issue, right there my ability to engage in the curriculum might be compromised. If you're talking and I don't hear well, we already have a pathway you've laid out that I can't get onto. All right? So there's a perceptual piece that has to kick in. You then have to actually recognize what you've just perceived. In other words, you are writing a math example on the board. I have to, one, be able to see it. I have to then recognize that the symbol that you've written, that one is a symbol. I have to recognize that that symbol means addition. And then I have to actually know what to do with that. That's the comprehension piece. So whether it's recognizing a math example or reading, I've got to be able to see, I've got to be able to recognize that letters and sounds are symbols of things so that I can decode. For what ultimate purpose? So that I can make meaning of words. So you can just see on this one example how many ways when a teacher is presenting information to a kid could sort of fall. We think of the kid has fallen off the track, but have they fallen off the track, or has there only been one track and they're hitting barriers on that track? So what Universal Design does is it says, okay, we know oversimplification, but when we are recognizing information, we know at least these kinds of three things are happening. Now, if you go back to your chart, Universal Design then says, the guidelines then say is, okay, for multiple means of representation, which is dealing with that recognition network, kids who need options for perception, okay, so we have a principle here, and then they have guidelines. Well, some kids we have to provide options for perception. Some kids we have to provide options for recognition of symbols, language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. And some kids need multiple options for comprehension. And comprehension might be the background knowledge, how do they make meaning? And for some kids, they may need all of the above, they may need this, but if we only have one way of presenting information, any number of kids will hit a roadblock. So what UDL has done through the principles is to say, when you think about how information is recognized, they have put together 3 guidelines that basically say, here are things to consider. When you know who your learners are, you can consider the following. Now, the sheet you have in front of you is very static, it's one-dimensional. Let me flip over to, but I want to show you what the real guidelines are about. If one in your packet, you have an excerpt of what I'm going to show you now, already written out in text. But they have the guidelines. Okay, so I go to Universal Design, all right, and I am about representation, all right. So let's say I want to know more about multiple means of representation. That's my first principle, all right. And then it provide options for perception. And then it begins to describe. Learning is impossible. I'm up here. Learning is impossible if imperceptible to the learner. And difficult when information is presented in formats that require extraordinary effort or assistance. To reduce barriers to learning, it's important to ensure that key information is equally perceptible to all learners by providing the same information through different modalities. We know this, that's redundancy. I talk it, I show it, we touch it. Providing information in a format that will allow for adjustability by the user. In other words, they can be on their computer screen, somebody can make the font bigger or smaller, they can change the contrast. That's the usability piece. Such multiple representations not only ensure information is accessible to the learner with particularly sensory and perceptual disabilities, but also easier to access and comprehend for many learners. So in other words, it's critical for the kid who has low vision. It just might enhance the learning for other kids who like, who read more comfortably with Arial font than Times Roman font. In other words, we have preferences in addition to disabilities. In other words, some of us like to read things in script, and some of us like to read things in block letters. Some of us like big font, some of us like small. Some of that has nothing to do with disability. And it's critical for the kid with low vision disability, but it's sort of nice and opens up pathways for anybody who might have a preference, because wouldn't we want, when somebody's preference is respected, what do? We increase engagement, don't we? And that's the interrelatedness. Okay, so what this allows us to do then is then say, okay, I know the basic idea of perception. Let me go down to this next one. Provide options for language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. And again, gives a very brief but focused description on what about recognition of language and symbols is killing a lot of kids out there. They do not have well-developed language skills, and we are a lot of talking heads to a lot of kids in school, all right? So it then, under each of the principles, under each of the guidelines, it has what they call checkpoints. So just as an example, I'm going to go to checkpoint 2.3. 2 is, it's the second principle, recognition of symbols. And then under that, there's 5 checkpoints. And if I just click on that checkpoint, it drills down, it tells me The ability to fluently decode words, numbers, or symbols that have been presented in an encoded format, blah, 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 and it describes that. It then says, here's a variety of just straightforward, simple ways to adapt, to create multiple pathways around supporting decoding. And then it says, I'd like to see some more examples. And I click on that, and then it takes me to a page that then just goes on and on and on, saying, and here are different tools. Almost all of them cost nothing. ClickSpeak. ClickSpeak is a text-to-speech function designed for sighted users who want to hear text read aloud. It's compatible with Windows and Mac. It's for all ages, for all content, free. You need an internet connection. Voki. Voki is a speech-to-text generator that allows the user to create a personal speaking avatar that can be embedded in a website. Free. So it then, now most of these are digital, they're technology, but there's a gazillion low-tech versions of all of these. So I don't want everybody to think we don't have the technology in our school, we can't do universal design. Certainly, I think Todd Rose makes a very compelling argument that we have the technology and we've got to get it into our schools and used correctly. But great teaching can be a low-tech affair. We all know that. We all know master teachers who have been doing UDL since before UDL was designed with no technology at all. So, but here's just stuff that's just sitting there waiting for you to click on it and determine, would this be a good tool in your toolbox or your teacher's toolboxes. So that's the design of that chart, is that for the 3 brain networks, each of those columns focuses on one, recognition, strategic, affective, and then it's the toolbox, if you will, or what they call them the guidelines. It's saying, how do we now make meaning of this? Because if you look at that language and you drill down, it's giving you concrete educational examples of when this is imperceptible to a student, they can't do this. If a student cannot encode, they can't do this particularly well. So it's gearing it towards those kids who are struggling, but in each case they're also saying it's critical for some, but it's actually good for everybody. And again, why would we outlaw people using curb cuts if they're not in a wheelchair? Same idea. And that's, to me, the beauty of UDL, is that what is critical for some, in most cases, with the exception of the most expensive individualized, augmentative communication systems that we know some kids require, so much of this is truly universal. I mean, that's the beauty of it, is, so much of this stuff is already on your phones. So much of this is already on the leapfrog your kids might be playing with. We've got to think about, if you're not already there, how do we strategically look at this? And that'll be towards the end of our session. We'll talk about those infrastructure kinds of things. But I wanted to make sure you understand how that tool is used. I think this is just brilliant. And I have to say, when I work with teachers, and I'll be doing a session tomorrow with teachers, they love this. They're just dying to click something and get an idea, especially if the idea is for free. So I just want to make sure everybody here's understanding. I mean, this is just, you go to UDL Center or CAST. I mean, this is just, there's no cost to any of this stuff. What I gave you in your packet, if you printed it out, it was the thing, oh no, we gave them to you, I'm sorry. The one that the chart was attached to, what I did was, this is just the text of everything on that website. All right? Again, universal design. Some of you like to read on a piece of paper. So for folks like me, I like having it in my hand and touching it. For many of you who were not born in 1975, you might be way more comfortable on the computer screen and everything in between. So what I did was on this packet, you'll see it starts on page 14. I only did 14 forward because this is where the guidelines start. Page 1 through 13 is just background on UDL. And you can get this right on the UDL websites, but just for saving a tree or two, you'll see it starts with Principle 1, multiple means of representation. I think it's just, there's nothing here that you would read and go, oh, I didn't know this. But it's you read it and go, duh, I know this. Why aren't I doing that? And maybe not you as administrators, but how do we get, so what we want to talk about is how do we get this into the hands of teachers and get them to actually believe this is what you want them to do. So you think, how they were talking about, you've got to go to the jet designers and say, these are the rules. At every level, there's somebody we're answering to or somebody we're taking directions from and being either manipulated by or guided by. So this is the kind of stuff, if this is the stuff you want your teachers to do, we've got to think about how do we make them believe that. We talked a little bit before we left on break about the recognition network, and again, that's the whole back part of our brain, and it's about something has to be perceptible, it's got to be recognizable, and it's got to be comprehensible. And those three processes, are the basis of the three guidelines under the first principle of representation and perception, symbols, comprehension. And this is just sort of a very quick overview. The recognition network, receive and analyze information. In other words, at the most fundamental level, it's about recognizing patterns, concepts, and relationships. The UDL response is multiple and flexible means of presentation. Why? Because we're trying to reduce perceptual barriers and we're trying to reduce cognitive barriers. And I use the term cognitive here not in the sense of what is the kid's IQ, but cognitive meaning what cognitive processes must a kid be using to be able to comprehend. And a big part of this is language and vocabulary and background knowledge. We have lots of kids in our schools who are bright little kids, but they do not have the background knowledge to be able to make sense, is what we were talking about during the break, to make sense of a lot of what's going on in the classroom. Because if you're doing a unit on the ocean, and this kid has never seen an ocean, has never talked about an ocean, has never been to a museum to see a diorama about an ocean, you might have a kid who's not gonna grasp the introduction to the unit on the ocean. So it's reducing cognitive barriers as well, which is a lot about the building of background knowledge. And what I've done here on this little thing is I've just picked out the low-tech, no-tech versions. A lot of the stuff you'll find on the UDL website gives you access to these great digital programs, apps, things like that. But I am a firm believer, because of my own challenges around technology, is that I just don't believe you can only have a universally designed world that relies strictly on technology. Again, we shouldn't be overlooking what it does. I mean, it's the great leveler. You know, I have said to teachers over and over again, think about how many kids you have who can't read, who wouldn't be qualified as learning disabled if they had taken the test with digital text, right? It's the great, and I'm not proposing that we're going to do that, but I mean, it's the great leveler for so many of our kids, what technology is going to do. All right, so you'll see a little chart like this in your PowerPoint for each of the 3 principles, the real low-tech versions of this. Okay, so this is my favorite because I'm just fascinated by the whole executive skill network. I just, you know, it's like walking into a middle school. Any of you work with middle schools? Does anybody have an executive, does anybody have a strategic network in middle school? Do you know what I'm saying? I really, it's just, you know, you're seeing, there's so much knowledge we have now about this whole part of the brain, which is really the front part of our brain. It's where our executive skills are. And when I look at the kinds of struggles so many kids with disabilities have, forget about kids, you know, I mean, just LD, I mean, you know, where so much of the executive stuff has come to light as to what the challenges are. But then you walk into, and you read any of the science research about how this part of our brain does not fully develop until early adulthood in most people. You know, so why we expect kids in middle school to remember their pencils is sort of beyond me. You know, I mean, it's like maybe they will, but maybe they won't. But we have to teach them. We have to scaffold, because many of the tasks that need to be done in school are relying on that kids can plan, execute, and monitor their actions. And I would just say, how's that going? You know, we have many, many kids we have to do incredible scaffolding for. And what I think is we get that intuitively for kids in K1 and 2, and somewhere around mid-elementary, upper L, we start thinking they're just short adults. And they're not. They're just taller kids who don't have really well-defined executive functions. And the scaffolding we give them is what keeps them moving forward, while sometimes their neurology is trying to catch up. So I find this part just fascinating. So again, there's 3 components from the UDL perspective around what goes into planning and executing actions. Okay, so this is the how of the brain. If the recognition is the what do you perceive, what do you understand? The strategic is, well, now what are you going to do with that information? You tell me, I want you to write a 5-sentence paragraph on, starfish, right? 1, I need to know what a starfish is. I need to know what a paragraph is. Okay. Then, as I begin to think about that task, I'm relying on my strategic network. So, at the very first level, there's a movement component. I need to be able to actually physically do the action. If you want me to write, I have to be able to write. I have to be able to pick a pen up in my hand or click a keyboard. There's not only one way to write, but there's a motor component to this. So that's the first thing that's got to kick in, is your motor component. Then you have to be able to do whatever that motor skill is. You have to do it with some degree of fluency. If I'm going to be writing, I may have the physical capacity to write, but if I don't have the skills and the fluency around writing that paragraph could just be a deal breaker for me. So if I don't have those writing skills, I could, again, just be, and you only give me one way to write, and you give me no scaffolding, you don't give me a graphic organizer, you don't help me think about how to get better at writing, I may have a problem. And then the third piece is the actual planning and execution. I can write, I have the motor capacity, I actually can write a paragraph, I have good expressive language skills. Now I need to say, okay, that actually requires me getting a pencil out of my desk. I have to find my journal. I now have to place my name on the paper in a certain way. You know, that's the executive skill, that being able to plan, prioritize, and sort of monitor, you know, I have to do some degree of monitoring, self-monitoring, and that's all up here. And we have kids who, around any one of those three areas, provide options for physical action, okay? These are really where we may have to provide a switch, a different tool, something that truly is providing an alternative for the physical action of the more traditional you will write, you will speak. Provide options for expression and communication, multiple tools for construction and composition, so that's the skill and fluency, multiple media for communication, so if this is, you want me to communicate about something, I need multiple pathways with which I can do that. Build fluencies with graduated levels of support. So this is sort of, so much of all of this in UDL is around when kids can't do something, we scaffold so that they can do it. The whole idea here is sort of, it's just, what does it take to get the kid to do it? We don't say a kid can't do it, therefore he doesn't have access to it. It just flips it, again, on its head to say, what tools for expression would this kid need to be able to write that paragraph? We're not going to let them not do this work, because this is what being a fourth grader is about. It's expressing yourself, So what will we have to do if the kid can't do it in that average way? And then the last is the executive functions. So that's the goal setting, planning, strategy development, managing information and resources, and the ability for kids to monitor their own progress. That is an awful lot of brain work, and we have many, many kids with and without disabilities where the level of executive skills we are expecting them to demonstrate may far exceed their current capacity. Again, it's the kid who doesn't remember his pencil, the kid who can't self-initiate a task. You say everybody begin, and everybody else in 40 seconds is working on the task, and this one kid is trying to figure out if he's in the right room. Do you know what I mean? So, and we have a lot of those kids who are not kids with disabilities. Critical for some and good for all. So the same kind of thing, this is connected. You would use this tool in the exact same way. That's the major principle. And there are 3 guidelines, and each guideline has its checkpoints, again, either on the online, or again, this is the written version. You could just flip to strategic work right now. And the summary, make it possible. The strategic network makes it possible to generate mental and motor patterns and develop strategies to plan, execute, and monitor actions and skills. So where UDL is looking to reduce, at the most basic level, the motor barriers. Again, you want me to write? I can't hold a pencil. Well, give me another way to communicate that. But also it goes back to the cognitive barriers as well. And again, I'm not talking about IQ, I'm talking about what degree of cognitive demand is that task requiring of me, and do I have that degree of cognition at this point? And if not, what is the scaffolding that needs to be built around that kid, hopefully temporarily. But for some kids, if we truly believe the idea that we are more diverse than we are the same, then we have to stop thinking that all scaffolding will at some point disappear. In other words, if we're saying, I'll give the kid a graphic organizer now, but I expect him by the end of the year to not need a graphic organizer, at some point you would say, who cares? He uses a graphic organizer for the rest of his life. If he writes a quality paragraph, isn't that the point? I don't care that he needed a graphic organizer to do it. But I will spend the time to teach the kid how to use a graphic organizer effectively, because that's the only way I'm going to get the kid to access the curriculum, which is really about being able to express oneself through words that remain after you say them. So I can teach them how to do text to speech to text. I can teach them how to use a graphic organizer. We've got to stop thinking about all of these are things we will always take away from kids. That's, I think, a lot of our problems. We scaffold for kids at the elementary level and begin to remove scaffolds, I think, when all of the evidence is showing us that when you took that scaffold away, boom. And then we said, oh, this kid must have a disability. Let's refer him, or we'll RTI him, or, well, maybe the scaffolding was removed prematurely or ineffectively. So I think UDL is trying to get us to say, this is maybe who the learner is. We want to make that kid an independent learner, but using a graphic organizer does not preclude a kid independently writing a passage. See, we have a very sort of odd sense of what independence is. If we think the only way you can do something is to have no tool to make it independent, how many of us go to the grocery store without our shopping list? It's the thing is that I find so fascinating is we probably have never had more tools available to us as adults to manage our lives than we have right now. And I think that's what sort of Todd Rose is saying is, why aren't we using those? Why are we thinking we have to take a pound of flesh out of a kid so they can earn their right to have a smartphone that helps them manage their lives? It just is wacky. All right, so you're getting the gist here. Again, low-tech versions of this, and this, we live in a world where multimedia is just an integral part of school. So a lot of these are going to be the use of multimedia, but they're still pretty ubiquitous tools that we can be using for kids. And then the last, but far from the least, and again, as I said, David Rose, who's the sort of, I guess maybe like the sort of CEO, he sort of has spearheaded the whole universal design movement. He was one of the professors I had this summer, and it was just really interesting hearing him talk about just all of the research, the most recent research is saying all of the networks are critical, but we have underestimated how profound that affective network is in bringing kids to the proverbial table in school and finding success. So I think there's a lot of work here that many of our schools have yet to even begin, because I think there's just so much research coming out about new ways to think about this. But the three areas are about how do we recruit kids' interest, how do we help them sustain their effort and persevere. So in other words, how do we just get the hook in? For some kids, they may start off fine. How do they sustain that attention and learn persistence and perseverance? There are a lot of habits of mind, if you will, that I think cross over between affective and some of the executive skill piece, because something like persistence, perseverance, I think that's so intricately connected to your frontal lobe. And then the last is self-regulation. I mean, and isn't that real? You know, I go into a lot of schools and people are saying, yeah, we want to do well with the standards, but right now our biggest problem is behavior. That's what this stuff is. You know, really effective learners are kids who can pay attention, can persevere, and can self-regulate. And that's, again, where I think, you know, David Rose, they read, this trumps everything. Just that kind of statement when somebody says, oh my God, don't even talk to me about the standards. You know, we just got, you know, kids pinging off the wall. That just sort of, you know, supports the idea of kids who can't self-regulate are typically not kids who can easily, and they may be some of your brightest kids, but they're that 50,000 that might be leaving. And then again, same idea, so I'm not going to go through each of these, but you know, for engagement or affective, we've got the recruiting interest, sustaining effort, and self-regulation. And a lot of this is really about relationships. You got to know your kids. You know, it is, well, you got to know your kids for all of them, because we get, you know, we can say, oh, I'm making multiple pathways, but if none of them are the pathway you need, you know, it's, again, we're working harder, not smarter. So all of this is predicated on you've got to know who your learners are. So you have, you know, a little summary for each. So again, these are the three networks. One of the things I find really interesting, and again, I'm a lifelong special educator, and this is the stuff that keeps me up at night, that we can't figure this piece out. Most teachers, when they hear about universal design, they'll first say, well, how will I know all of this stuff about my kids? How do I figure all of this stuff out? Very reasonable question, and I think teachers are far more skillful at finding that out about their kids than sometimes they think. You know, that so much of this is informal assessment. You know, we don't need a lot of very fancy things. But what I find fascinating is the very purpose of an IEP is to basically say to you, you're Billy's 4th grade teacher. I am going to identify everything you need to know about Billy as a learner. I'm going to put it in one place, and I'm going to hand it to you. You don't have to do any work. I'm giving you all the information you need to know to personalize. And somehow, you know what I'm saying? And it does not translate in the real world that way. We still have many teachers who are saying, that's not me. That's not me, or, yeah, I teach the kid, but, you know, that's about special ed. It's, you know, and that's the piece I find we have got to figure out. Is if I was a classroom teacher and I had kids on IEPs in my class, I'd be saying, thank you for giving me that IEP, because you have just saved me untold hours of problem solving. Thank you. Give me more kids on IEPs. So is it that we don't write IEPs well? That's part of it. Do we still have a culture of your kid, my kid? That's part of it, and I'm sure many other things. But I think that's, you know, when I asked you the first question of what's the problem out there, that's for me. That's my big issue. is there's some barrier that most of our systems have not yet figured out about that kind of connection. You know, and to me, how integral, because if we believe critical for some, good for all, then I say it is critical you do this for Billy. Theoretically, you do that for Billy, and 7, 8 of your other kids who have no plan, nobody to tell you how to find the right pathway for them. The fact that you made it available for Billy and said everybody can use that, those kids came to the table. And we all know of situations where teachers come afterwards and say, yes, that accommodation you said I had to do, all the other kids are asking for it, is the proof of that. And somehow we can't figure out how to take this to scale. We have pockets of excellence. We've got classroom teachers who, like I said, they invented UDL before there was UDL. You know, we have some fantastic people in our schools. Something is out of whack here, and I'm hoping through some of our discussion you'll be able to think about what is it in your system, you know, that might be out of whack. Okay, so you get the gist. I'm going to leave this, but isn't this a great tool? And again, the computer version and this, I just want to make sure everybody understands, this starting on page 14 is literally, if I cut and pasted everything off the computer, it's right here, okay? So for some of us, this is the document to laminate, you know, because if I have to keep remembering that website. But I did give you the website, is on one of your slides, cast.org and udlcenter.org. The guidelines are available in all of those, as well as other really great tools. Okay, so I want to sort of just keep moving this on the curriculum piece. As it relates to instruction, UDL talks about the traditional way we have viewed curriculum is the problem. You know, it's the one size fits all. But what is curriculum? You know, it's easy to say it's the curriculum that's disabled. Well, what does that actually mean? It's not the series you just purchased from Harcourt Brace. Curriculum in this context is what we would traditionally think of if a district developed its curriculum. It's what are the goals? And goals here really, you know, connect hopefully to standards in some capacity, the methods, materials, and assessment. And what UDL is saying is these are the components that when we say the curriculum has to be flexible, this is what we're talking about. It's not the curriculum is flexible, it's the methods we use, you know, the tools we're actually putting into the hands of teachers or asking teachers to do is where the flexibility is. So the first one I want to start with, these are fairly self-explanatory, you all know what these are, but this is the one, I do a lot of work with teachers on standards, writing IEPs that connect with standards, and you know, we've got to look at what kids are expected to do, that, you know, guaranteed curriculum, that kind of stuff. And this, I love, this was one of the first things when I was reading about UDL, I just was like, yes! You put the words to exactly what I've been struggling with. And UDL talks a lot about when we are interpreting standards or curricular goals, we very often embed into the goal something that is really not there. And by embedding it, we have now taken something that most kids could do and we've made it something only some kids can do. And they talk about you differentiate goals from the means. In other words, if the standard says the student will communicate, the student will describe the main idea and 3 details, the purpose of that standard is knowing main idea and 3 details and being able to communicate it through some means. Once a teacher says, my lesson goal is you will write an essay about main idea and details, and that's the only way a kid can show me they know main idea and details. You see, I've embedded a means, you must write, that was not in the standard. We do that all the time in schools, and it's killing a lot of kids. And the discussions and the arguments that we have, you know, where I'll talk to special ed teachers and they'll say, well, you know, Mr. So-and-so, the science teacher said they have to write a, you know, 5-paragraph essay and da-da-da-da-da. Show me where in the standards or in the state competencies it says you have to do that. It's not there. But in his class, you will not get out of his class if you don't do that. And I'm saying there's something fundamentally wrong about that. Okay? And that's the piece about UDL is, now that doesn't mean that there aren't some standards that do have the means embedded in them. But let's not put them there when they're not there. We'll have a hard enough time with the ones that truly are there, because we know there are some standards. Like some of the reading standards means you do have to read. But there's many of the reading standards that if you listen to something, you'd actually get the essence. You know, you'd be able to demonstrate to me that you got the inferences. You can't read it, but you can listen to it and you can infer with the best of them. Do not tell me that that ability to infer is not as valuable as if you read it. Okay, so that's what the goals part is here. We need to be very careful, and now I'm talking about as leaders, we have got to make sure our teachers are not on their own or as a department, you know, drawing lines in the sand that actually serve to exclude kids, that serve as barriers to access versus creating multiple pathways. And I know that this can be very difficult because I've had those discussions, you know, that can get pretty heated with teachers. But sometimes you just look at the words and it's there or it's not. Okay, so that's the first piece. The methodology, again, it's being able to look at what are the high probability strategies, instructional strategies that we know work, and having having some degree of flexibility with that. And that's the same with materials. Now, a lot of what Todd Rose was talking about is a lot of the variable and flexible materials are media-driven and digital-driven. But again, we all know those low-tech versions of a teacher who comes up with 6 different ways kids are able to describe vocabulary words. So it doesn't have to be media-driven. And then the last is the assessment. So the key word is all of these have to be variable and flexible. And the assessment truly has to be designed to let a kid demonstrate what they know and are able to do. And when the assessment takes on a purpose other than what its stated purpose is, in other words, does the assessment really just assess can the kid write, versus does the assessment assess can the kid describe the main idea in details? And those are 2 very different things. Now, some assessments truly want to know if the kid can write. But that's why we have to have clarity of purpose. And I do a lot of traveling in a lot of different places, and I think this is so not as far along people's understanding of this, universally understanding this. Are there teachers who get this? Of course there are. But there are also teachers who don't get it, teachers who are actually quite resistant, and whole pockets of departments and, you know, grade level teams, you know, who just say this, it's our way or the highway. And I would imagine those are some of the real challenges all of us are struggling with. But so when we talk about accessible curriculum, it's not some amorphous thing that's not familiar to us as educators. It's about what are the instructional goals, the methods, the methodology, and the assessment. That's what is disabled from a UDL perspective, is when these are one size fits all. That's the problem. And it really shifts the issue from that's what the disability is, or that's what the problem is, to it shifts it to it's the kid. It's the kid, it's their parent, it's kids these days, all of that kind of stuff. All right. So, what I want to share with you now is just sort of shifting gears to getting, for the rest of our session, for you to be thinking about these ideas relative to wherever you come from and what you're doing. Recognizing that all of you are already engaged in some number of school improvement activities. That this is not that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. I am not in any way proposing, next year we're doing UDL, because I don't think that's how you do UDL. So within the context of whatever your environment is, the people, the UDL folks have talked about that there's a systematic change process that's not unique to UDL, but one that many of us as school administrators, because of the pressure of time, do more with less, sometimes lack of resources. I think our biggest lack of resource is time and planning. And we don't plan because we don't have time. We don't have time to plan, and we don't think we will have time to actually roll out an initiative or a new process in truly the way that it requires. Which is any major change to practice, you're usually talking about multiple years. And UDL, to me, is ultimately gained at truly redesigning schools. You don't start by saying we're going to redesign the school. It's like how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. Just start, start slowly, but just start. I mean, we can find our entry point at any place. Back in New Hampshire, I work with a group of 16 school districts and have met for the last 8, 9, 10 years. Once a month, I meet with the special ed directors from this sort of little collaborative. And it's a professional development opportunity for people. We do a lot of collaborative training for all of the teachers in their district. And we have been focusing on collaboration, gen ed, special ed collaboration, co-teaching for years. And last year we did a whole big thing with all the special ed teachers about universal design. How do you think about writing IEPs with Common Core, and how can universal design be the connective tissue between gen ed and special ed? And the common feedback we got from teachers is, where's general ed? You're telling us about universal design. When will general ed be a part of this discussion? It's a very legitimate, and as special ed directors, we didn't feel necessarily we had the opportunity to pull massive numbers of general ed teachers out. So we said, okay, let's this year take a different approach and start the year off inviting key general ed administrators from our 16 districts and engage in a conversation about, here's what we did, here's the feedback we got, we think universal design can be that connective tissue. How can we join forces? We've got money. This is a group where we have been squirreling away some dollars. So we have thousands of dollars to commit to training, not staff or anything, but that we could fully fund training, feed people, buy books, a whole bit. We just want to partner with gen ed because gen ed teachers won't come to a special ed workshop. They need you telling them to do this. long story short, they went away, said, we'll think about it, we'll get back to you. And the feedback we got was, there's so much stuff already going on in districts that we don't want to add another initiative. So that they were looking at UDL as another thing they would be putting on teachers' plates to do, as opposed to saying, you are learning how to implement a whole new set of standards. Might we want to, from the get-go, think about creating more pathways? So it was a very, it would like almost made me cry, you know, where we thought, oh, we're being so collaborative, all this stuff. And again, these are not bad people at all. These are very busy, very hardworking principals, some assistant supers, some curriculum people. And it was like we had one of these moments, you know, of just, we were all in the same room, and somehow or other we came out having had two completely separate conversations. And that to me was sort of symptomatic of what I see in many of the districts I travel to. So, you know, we can't underestimate the need to test those waters and build some of those partnerships very early on. And my sense is special ed will never do UDL. It sort of doesn't make sense. I mean, UDL is what everybody has to do. It's about curriculum. Where's curriculum happening? In classrooms. So special ed bringing in this will always have one hand tied behind its back. And that's the collaborative piece here that I think is so interesting to have a mixed group, is figuring out what part of this resonates and makes sense and actually has something to do with where your district is at, because everyone will have a separate entry point. So I apologize that I don't have all of these slides, but if you have them, and it's again that very symptomatic. You've got to explore, you've got to think about implementation, and you know eventually you go up to scale. So what I would like is to point out, I think I do have these. I want to show you what one district did as they began their administrative planning. And these tools, it was I think in a separate packet. Do you have this? Yes? Okay. So now they already made their decision to explore UDL, not to explore it, to think about implementing, bringing into their system concepts around universal design. And then as an administrative team, now again, I think they actually had a very diverse group of people in this planning. It wasn't strictly administrative, but the administrators were owning the process because they were going to commit the resources. They identified 8 very specific areas that they felt were going to be critical to their implementation. You know, and you can just see it, you know, brief little description. One, what was the technology infrastructure? You know, they were saying we aren't going to ignore the technology part of UDL. We want to embrace that. We need to make sure every building has the capacity to go to scale over time with that. So the infrastructure part of bandwidth and adequate, you know, computers. The digital content resources. Systematically and very carefully selecting what those tools were, how they were going to get them, where they were going to be, what access was going to be. So the purchasing and the maintaining and the equitable distribution of those tools, what needed to happen around clear administrative support, the teacher training piece, the redefined roles. This was one of my favorite, the redefined roles for general ed and special ed. Because I think if you truly embrace the concepts of universal design, it really pokes at what we think of as the traditional gen ed special ed roles. You know, from my perspective, it blurs the lines, which again can be very nerve-wracking for many, many people. A lot of people don't like blurry lines. They want very clear, concrete things. I think our schools will benefit when things get muddier, you know, or blurrier in the lines. Collaborative curriculum planning. You know, talk is cheap. We want people to collaborate, and we don't give them time to do that in any kind of meaningful way. How to involve parents in the community. And then the last, which is, you know, the bane of all of our existence, and that's funding. You know, so not only how do you build capacity within the general budget, because that's going to be the sustainability piece, but then also what kind of creative ways, you know, can you expand, augment, you know, grants, those kinds of things. So they developed this tool, and then, you know, the next page, well, you know, they began their implementation plan. Now, this was a plan that was developed in 2002. So Concord was doing this about 12, well, would be what now, 14 years ago. You know, began this process. They were one of the early school districts involved with CAST, you know, in looking at some of this stuff. So some of the terminology you might see here might look a little dated, just because it really is an old plan. You know, so I think if something was being written in 2014, some of that might look different. But this was sort of their model, their plan, and then they broke it down into, you know, truly a work, you know, like a punch list of who is going to do what by when to monitor the plan. And all of us in our various districts have done some version of this around something. So there's nothing unique about implementing UDL, but as with anything that's going to get sea legs, it really requires planning. So this is just an example of how a district has tried to systematically, and look at these dates here. I mean, these are things, you know, 2002. I mean, they're a district in a totally, totally different place now. Now, some of the challenges are, I bet you some of the successes they had here are also things that in some cases there's no evidence of any longer. And that's always the challenge in any system, is sustainability. You know, you get certain leaders who leave, and all of a sudden, well, we don't do UDL anymore. We do responsive classrooms now, or we do, you know, RTI, or we're doing inclusion this year, whatever it is. So, you know, I don't want to hold Concord up as, you know, anything other than a real live hardworking school district, but I just thought it was interesting. You know, 12 years ago, they were grappling with, how are we going to move our special ed department, because the initiation of it was with special ed, but to say this has such broader implications for our whole school district. All right, so blah, blah, blah. With that, what I would like to do now is to give you some table time to be thinking, is everybody here with somebody from their district or somebody they can talk to? Okay, because if not, you can talk to me. But it's an opportunity to look at, you know, some of these ideas and think about, where is your district at here? Where are you at? Because many of you, I'm sure, you're way past the recognition stage of needing it, but it still may be a closed discussion. Some of you are, well, not some of you are further along. Some of you, this lady may be further along. But, you know, it sounds like many people are at that beginning stage. Remind people, these are the two websites I've been talking about. CAST, Center for Applied Special Technologies, they have, and a lot of this is stuff I'm going to share with the teachers tomorrow, they have curriculum builder tools, they have programs that you can, what they call a book builder, where you can take text, put it in, create annotated text, digitize. They have a special program around making science more accessible. There are some wonderful, wonderful tools. The center is a project of CAST. So you'll see some information is the same on both of them, but the center also, each has sort of some different programs. So you'll see a lot of, the guidelines will be on both, but you'll find different things. So it is worth your while looking through this. And for nothing else, just more of the guidelines. But there's just a wealth of information. And all of their tools are free. You have to register, but then you have access to some programs that are really just great. And some of the stuff I'll share with teachers tomorrow is they give you a template. Classroom profile builder, where you could list your kids out and then start thinking, what does this kid like to do? What does this kid like to do? And it gives you software you can start clustering kids to say, for this, my profile this year is I've really got kids who need a lot more visual input than I'm providing. So there's some great, great tools there. Look at those. The book you got, this is written by the CAST people. The first half of the book is just overview UDL. The second half are content-specific chapters that are talking about how teachers, content teachers, not special ed teachers, content teachers, are embedding UDL into science, social studies, the arts. So when you're talking to teachers, these are great things to be sharing with them. The other book I want to mention to you, and this is a homegrown Indiana person. Louis Lord Nelson is somebody who is a UDL person who has worked for Bartholomew Consolidated School District. She has just published a book on UDL. I just finished reading it. I forgot to bring it with me. But if you just Google Louis Lord Nelson, UDL, it'll come up for Amazon, whatever. Also, a practitioner's book. It's not about administration stuff, but, if you're looking for materials for your staff. So those are all great resources. The last thing I would say, and then I know we have just a few, is stop asking me if we're almost there. For crying out loud, we're nomads. Isn't this, it's just sort of like, you're never going to get there. Quit thinking you're going to get there. It's just a big joke they're playing on you. You're nomads. We just need to make sure we're going in the right direction, because we're never going to get there. But we want to be doing the right work, good work. We don't want to work harder. We don't want to be scraping off somebody else's car, although that's not a bad thing to do. That's collaborative, but you get my gist. So thank you all very, very much. This is my third time back to Indiana, and you're just all so nice. Your weather stinks, but you're all nice, okay? So have a wonderful evening, and I'll hopefully see folks tomorrow.